It had been 3 years since the last League spaceships had left planet Verdum. Melkan gazed at the ruins of what once had been, millennia ago, a stone manor. He liked the mix of calm and melancholy that washed over him. Calm because there was nothing left to be done. Melancholy because he would never see his family again. In the sky, the mother planet revealed its golden fissures, as if the very fabric of matter were a crack, as if Earth were tired of bearing the weight of history. The League had left Melkan on Verdun because he was the planet's last archivist, and by the archivist's code, he was forbidden to abandon his world. Thus, Melkan, besides being the last archivist, was the last living person on Verdun. 3 years later, he still returned every evening to the place where the last ship had taken off. There grew the great tree that his father said had been planted by their family millennia ago. The last genetically unmodified species on the entire planet. Melkan did not know if he had made the right decision. There was something irreversible about staying behind. He was divided within himself. When the first dwarf moons began to appear around the mother planet, he decided to return home. On that day, he finally made up his mind. He needed to find in the archivist library the document he had read centuries ago before entering cryogenic sleep. He had hidden it, but something unexpected had happened since he had awakened. He could not remember where he had hidden the file. Melkan was trained to remember. During 2 centuries of training, he learned to meticulously catalog and describe events, images and stories, architectures and sounds. Memory, the masters of the path used to say, was the last truly human territory. And now, standing before the silent shelves of the underground library, Melkan felt something he had never experienced before, the suspicion that his own mind had betrayed him, or worse, that someone had helped it to betray him. How could he forget something so important? He still maintained the practices of the initiates. He recited the canon of the archive every day upon waking. Number 1. The archivist does not abandon his world. Number 2. The archivist does not transmit memory over the network. Number 3. The archivist records by hand. Number 4. The archivist accepts error. Number 5. The archivist does not interfere, only observes. He wondered if, by hiding the archive, he had violated some kind of law of memorization that he did not yet have access to because he was still an initiate, and because of this, was beginning to lose his memorization skills. He went home and just tried to sleep. One of the side effects of years of cryogenic sleep is the constant insomnia that lingers for years after waking up. Even so, the little sleep he got was enough to make him feel better. Melkan lived in a level 3 residence of the League, the only one that had been left intact before the planet was declared uninhabitable in the long term. The League could not waste resources on a planet that could not sustain life stably for thousands of years, and it could not leave traces and ruins that might be mistaken for the planet's original ruins, of civilizations long lost. In the morning he got up, fed his dog, ate and went out. He liked to walk the path on foot. It helped establish the breathing rhythm suitable for memorization. As he walked, he tried to keep his eyes on the trail to establish a state of focus. The archivist library remained intact. Hundreds of stone and metal shelves held centuries of handwritten records. Melkan walked slowly among them, running his fingers over the worn spines. He had hidden the document. He remembered the decision, he remembered the fear, but he did not remember the act itself. At least 20,000 years after the development of interstellar travel, records were still kept in the way archivists considered most reliable. By speech, the archivist would dictate, and a transcriber would write by hand, using treated magnetite, resistant to time and radiation. The tradition arose after the banning of machines. Among the scholars of the path, there was an almost unanimous theory. Humanity had first developed writing. Marks, symbols, visual records. Organized speech, complex language would have emerged later, perhaps as an attempt to make records accessible to the many who could not decipher signs. some individual considered anomalous in their time had discovered that they could produce controlled variations of sound. These sounds came to represent the symbols, and thus the first language was born. Curiously, the planets that adopted language as the dominant form of cultural transmission prospered more quickly than those that remained with only silent writing. Melkan alternated between searching the archives, reading for pleasure, and essential memorization exercises. On the third night of searching, exhausted, Melkan left the library without having found anything. He wandered aimlessly inside the library and, suddenly, Melkan hears something in the old wing of architectural relics. A metallic noise. An automatic door trying to open. He knows there shouldn't be any power there. He finds a woman sitting on the floor, leaning against a white wall marked by time. Confused, disoriented, but conscious. She looks at him and says, "What cycle is this?" Year 3, after the evacuation. Evacuation? The League has left. Wasn't that in the schedule? No, it wasn't. You stayed? Along the way? So you're an archivist? I was. Her eyes rolled back and her body lost strength. Melkan caught her before she hit the floor. It was a common symptom after cryogenic awakening. Temporary neural disorientation, vascular instability, and lapses in consciousness. He took her home. He took her to the house and settled her on the main room sofa. He adjusted the ambient temperature to stable levels and watched her for a few minutes. Regular breathing, no convulsions, no fever. He stepped away. The next morning he woke up early and prepared breakfast with methodical movements, warmed synthetic bread and an infusion of local leaves, one of the few varieties that still grew naturally. He heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. She was standing, lightly leaning against the wall, still pale but conscious. She sat at the table without ceremony, ate in silence, and after a few moments spoke. "Merina, that's my name," he nodded, giving his own. "Is that what you did before the sleep?" She chewed slowly before answering. "Field biologist, specialized in species. Pre-genetic modification." He looked up for the first time. Pre-modification? Species that existed before the mass adaptive intervention, before ecological standardization. She ran her fingers along the rim of the cup. Verdum was one of the last places with enough intact diversity for study, she said. The League didn't consider Verdun sustainable in the long term, he said. She gave a slight smile. Sustainable, according to which model? He didn't answer. She looks around the room and says, "You stayed because you're an archivist." It wasn't a question. Along the way, he replied. She asked, "And does the way say you must die with the planet, if necessary?" The way says the archivist does not abandon his world. She stared at him for a few seconds. Even if the world is wrong? The question hung in the air, between them. He answered with trained neutrality. The archivist does not judge. He only records. She rests her elbows on the table. "So, did you record the evacuation?" "Yes." "And did you record that I was scheduled to remain in stasis for another 400 years? The soft sound of the wind against the structure was the only immediate response. He chose caution. "I recorded the official schedule." She tilted her head. Official was too heavy a word for such a silent mother. She finished eating and stood up. She walked to the window. She saw in the distance the solitary tree in the open field. "Is that species native?" He quoted a fraction of a second. "It's ancient." She turned to him. "It doesn't look modified." "It's not." Her eyes changed. There was no reproach. There was interest. "So there is still something here that hasn't been corrected." He didn't answer. The day went on with Melkan and Merina talking more and getting a better understanding of who this stranger living near her now was. The light from the dwarf moons streamed through the tall windows of the level 3 residence, casting pale bands across the metallic floor. Melkan spoke about the family with an almost documentary precision at first. Dates, positions, formal occasions. But as the hours went by, the formality faded. He explained that his parents, his sister and his brother had left with the League. He said his parents felt a pride, an almost solemn pride, that he had been chosen as the last archivist of Verdum. Chosen to stay, chosen to preserve, chosen not to leave. He said this with a practiced neutrality, but Merina noticed. There was something too rigid in the way he mentioned pride, as if it were a medal too heavy to bear, as if behind the honor there was a question that had never been asked. Why me? When he spoke of his siblings, however, his tone changed. An involuntary smile appeared when he mentioned Jimoa, her absurd jokes, her ability to laugh at inappropriate moments. When he spoke of Ronin, his eyes lost their rigidity. He would talk about how they had different tastes. Ronin was fascinated by orbital engineering, while Melkan preferred archives and ancient structures. But even so, they remained close. Not because of similarity, but by choice. Merino listened without interrupting. When he spoke about himself, he was briefer. He said he never knew a mother. There was no drama in the statement, just a fact. But the father... She spoke of her father in a different tone. Administrator of the Homos Observatory, capital of Verdum, level 5 residence, the highest, most protected, and closest to the centers of decision-making. She described the observatory with a restrained glow, transparent domes, gravitational rings, rooms where the slightest deviation of orbits was measured with micrometer precision. My father used to say that observing was a source of love, she remarked, almost absent-mindedly. Melkan noted the phrase but did not respond immediately. There was something in that idea that clashed with the path. The archivist observes but does not interfere. Her father observed in order to protect, to adjust, to correct, and perhaps that was why she could not so easily accept the idea of orbital abandonment as something inevitable. There was a comfortable silence. After that, it was not the empty silence of Verdum, but the silence of two conscious presences sharing the same space. In the late afternoon, they went out together to the tree. Merina touched the trunk with a technical yet almost irreverent care. It grew more than it should have, she murmured. Melkan frowned. 3 years, with this level of radiation and this gravitational instability, no. She didn't seem alarmed, she seemed intrigued. For a moment, Melkan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The possibility that Verdun was still reacting. That was dangerous, because if the planet was still reacting, maybe it wasn't as doomed as the League claimed. Twilight fell unhurriedly over Verdun. The level 3 residents always kept the lighting at a constant tone, simulating the natural cycle of a stable planet, even though Verdun was no longer one. Melkano was organizing some records on the main table. Merina was observing a small plant sample he had collected near the tree. That's when it happened. The light flickered. It didn't go out. It just flickered. An almost imperceptible pulse ran through the ceiling lights. A brief tremor, as if the house had blinked. Merino looked up. Melkan did too. External thermal fluctuation, he said after a few seconds. It was the simplest explanation. Merino didn't respond. The sample in her hand was still vibrating slightly because of the abrupt movement of the table. A few seconds later, everything returned to normal. The lighting stabilized. The climate control system resumed its steady hum. Melkan got up unhurriedly and walked over to the control panel embedded in the wall. Simple analog interface. He went through the data. No critical alerts. No structural failure warnings. But there was something, a small marker in the energy log. 0.7% variation in core output. Irrelevant. almost statistically insignificant. He closed the panel. Fluctuation within the margin, acceptable, he said. Merina stood up and approached the display. Acceptable margin for how long? He hesitated. The reactor was designed to operate for millennia. She crossed her arms and said, designed doesn't mean unchangeable. Another fluctuation occurred, faster this time. This time, the lights dimmed for almost 2 whole seconds. Long enough for the silence to become heavy. Long enough for both of them to realize this wasn't just a thermal variation. The climate control system shut down. The air became still. Then, as if nothing had happened, everything came back. Belkin reopened the panel. Now there was a new data point. Unidentified external consumption. He felt something tighten around his ribs. External? Merina asked. There are no active external systems, he replied. Too fast. She didn't comment on his tone. The screen showed a thin graph. The energy wasn't being lost, it was being redirected in a narrow beam toward orbit. The girl took a deeper breath. This isn't a malfunction, he knew. But still, he said, it could be sensor noise. She lightly touched the panel. Noise doesn't create a pattern. There was silence. The home planet, visible through the window, seemed to be watching. A third oscillation occurred, weaker, more controlled, like a test, and then it ceased. The system stabilized completely. No new alerts, no continuation. If they hadn't seen it, they might have believed they imagined it. Melkin slowly turned off the panel. Let's keep monitoring, he said. Merina nodded, but didn't return to the sample. And he didn't return to the records. The archivist library remained silent. As always, the underground structure maintained a constant temperature. The air smelled of old metal and paper treated with mineral resins. It took the girl a few days to ask to accompany her. When she asked, it was simple. Can I see? He hesitated just long enough to realize he had hesitated, then they went down. Together, hundreds of stone and metal shelves held centuries of handwritten records. Engraved magnetite plates, synthetic parchments, hand-bound notebooks. Merina walked slowly between the rows. She ran her fingers along the spines, observing the labels, dates, events, migrations, climate collapses, evacuations. She stopped beside him. How much time do you spend here each day? As much as necessary. She looked up. That doesn't answer. He closed the volume he was reviewing. There wasn't much left of the planet to archive. Most of the recent records are repetitions of environmental patterns. Then review what exists. You review? I update descriptions, make adjustments, index, correct historical inaccuracies. She tilted her head. The archivists I knew were more itinerant. He didn't answer right away. She went on. They visited communities, recorded speech, followed cultural changes. There was silence. He set the book down on the reading table. There are no more communities. It was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. She walked over to one of the central tables and opened a random record. So, you keep the memory of a world that has already gone? Yes. And do you revise its memory? Yes. She closed the volume carefully. Is revised memory still memory? The question hung in the cold air of the library. She held her gaze for a few seconds. The error also needs to be documented. She seemed to accept the answer, but not entirely. In the following days, Merina began to frequent the library more regularly. Not for archiving, but for observation. And that's when she started to notice something. Melkan did not revise in a linear fashion. It did not follow chronological order. He chose specific moments. Open, browse, close, move to another section, return to the first. Like someone trying to remember where they left something. One afternoon, she heard him standing in front of an empty section.
A small space between two blocks of magnetite, almost imperceptible. He stayed there for too long, without touching, without recording, just looking. "Is something missing?" she asked in a low voice. He blinked, as if he had been pulled from a distant place. "Something is always missing." Too quick of a response, he moved away from the shelf and began reorganizing volumes that were already organized. Merina didn't insist, but at that moment she understood something. He wasn't just preserving memory, he was searching. And most curiously, he didn't seem to know exactly what. As she climbed the stairs back to the surface, Melkamp remained standing in front of the same space between the shelves. He remembered the decision, remembered the fear, remembered hiding the document, but he didn't remember the act itself. And the more he reviewed, the less he trusted his own mind. That's when the second oscillation came. It happened when they were in the oldest section of the library. Melkan had opened a volume about the first settlements in Verdum. Merina was analyzing a set of records on pre-adaptive fauna. The air was far too still. Then the light shook violently. Unlike the first time, this time it was abrupt. A sharp crack ran through the metal structures of the ceiling. The light dropped by half. The ventilation system emitted an irregular noise. Merina looked up and Melkan was already on his feet. The library's auxiliary panel, smaller and independent, was flashing with a red, intermittent warning. Critical variation in core output. Before he could get closer, everything went dark. Absolute silence. The library plunged into a dense mineral darkness. No ventilation, no lighting, no structural noise. Only their own heartbeat. For a few seconds, there was only breathing. Merina broke the silence. This isn't a fluctuation. He already knew by feeling his way. In the darkness, he activated a manual light stick, an emergency device kept there by old protocol. The weak light revealed dust particles suspended in the still air. "We need to go back," he said. They quickly climbed the stairs. When they emerged at the surface, they realized something worse. The house was completely dark. The windows no longer shone with their usual internal reflection. The main door did not respond to the sensor. Melkan opened it manually. Inside, total silence. The air already felt heavier, without circulation, without filtration. Merina walked to the central panel. Inactive. No data. No online system. "How long do we have time?" she asked, now objectively. Melkan did the calculations in his head. The house maintained thermal control, atmospheric filtration, hydroponic greenhouses, assisted irrigation, partial shielding against radiation. Without power, the temperature would drop drastically during the night. Filtration would cease. Food production would be interrupted, and gradual exposure to radiation would increase. "Days," he replied. She absorbed the information without panic. And the reactor, he was already heading toward lower access chamber. The mechanical display of the core showed something impossible. There was no structural failure. There was no damage. The core was not dead. It was drained. The energy was being redirected in a continuous flow out of the atmosphere. Orbital direction. Merino observed the trace on the analog display, a narrow, consistent beam. It wasn't an explosion, it wasn't a collapse. It was activation. She spoke slowly. "Something out there is awake." Melkan didn't reply, but for the first time since Merina had arrived, he felt something greater than the fear of loneliness. He felt displacement, as if Verdun was no longer empty. The night felt colder than usual. Without an active system, the level 3 residence was already beginning to lose thermal stability. The air felt drier, thinner. Melkan seemed to be sitting in front of the inactive panel, as if he could convince it to reactivate simply by staying there. Merina watched in silence. She didn't pressure him. She just waited for him to reach the conclusion on his own. Inevitable. "If the drainage continues," she said finally, "the core won't collapse. It empties." He nodded. and when it empties, the house dies before the planet does. He knew how to do calculations. He knew how to measure time. The rest knew how to record extinctions, but never had to calculate their own. She approached the Ramos Observatory. She said calmly, "There was an orbital maintenance ship not registered on civilian maps. It was used for external inspections. My father showed it to me when I was a child. Even if it exists, leaving doesn't solve the canon she didn't understand." Immediately he continued, "The archivist does not abandon his world." The phrase seemed heavier than any nuclear failure. "And what does it mean to abandon?" she asked. He took a deep breath. "To leave while the world still exists." "Does it exist?" she pressed, but without aggression. He looked out the window. Verdun was there. Stones, winds, the tree, ruins. But also unstable atmosphere, rising radiation, and dead infrastructure. There was a dilemma within Melkin. Although he had left behind some of the archivist's duties, there was still a veiled pride in that mission entrusted to him. He did not want to break the canon. "My father used to say that to observe is a form of love," she repeated softly. "But sometimes it's necessary to change one's point of observation." He closed his eyes for a moment. If he left, he would no longer be the last archivist of Verdun. He would be just another survivor. All the pride of his parents, all the honor of the path, all the identity built over 2 centuries displaced. He imagined the empty bookshelf in the library, the space between the records, the lost document. If he died there, he would never find it. And what if the archive contained something special? The canon said the archivist does not abandon his world, but it also said the archivist accepts mistakes. Perhaps staying was the mistake. He opened his eyes. "Where was this ship?" he asked. She did not smile, she simply answered. "Mountainous Sertu to the north, hangar, inspection, underground." He felt her only once. The decision had already been made, not on impulse, but by displacement inevitable. Before dawn, they walked to the library. Merina stayed at the door. Melkan went in alone. She ran a hand over the shelves, over the empty space, over the accumulated dust. She made no record of her departure. She wrote no farewell. She simply memorized it. She climbed the stairs for the last time as the resident archivist. When she reached the surface, the sky was still dark. "Are you ready?" she asked. He looked at Verdun, at the tree, at the horizon, at the fissured mother planet. He did not answer and began to walk. The walk to the mountainous sector was long and silent. With no power in the residence, the contrast with the outside environment seemed less pronounced. Verdun had always been a planet of muffled noises, wind, stone, mineral particles scraping against each other. Merina walked with confidence, consulting no maps, never hesitating at forks in the path. There was a bodily memory in that route, as if her feet remembered, before her mind even needed to organize the memory. Melkan watched. She knew that world in a different way. He knew it through the bookshelves, she through the living and technical structures. At a certain point during the climb, Merina returned to the subject she had been avoiding since waking up. Her cryogenic module shouldn't have been activated. Level 2 systems. They required multiple confirmations and physical redundancies. They were not susceptible to casual error. 3 simultaneous failures would be necessary for a premature awakening. The hypothesis of a systemic error did not convince her. Melkan listened, but offered only neutral responses. He had always been trained to accept the data before questioning its origin, record before suspecting. However, there was something he wasn't saying. He hadn't asked why she was programmed to sleep for 400 years. He didn't ask who had authorized it. He didn't ask who else had stayed behind. He now realized that his lack of curiosity had been remarkable, but it wasn't born from indifference. It was born from fear. If someone had awakened this deliberately, it implied operational continuity at some level, and that was a possibility he avoided naming. Merina, for her part, seemed to have interpreted his silence differently. There was a quiet sense of relief in her for not having been received as an anomaly, a failure, or a threat. He accepted her as a fait accompli. Perhaps that had been the first real gesture of trust between them. The mountain appeared ahead as a dark mass against the pale sky. The golden fissures of the mother planet lit up the slopes unevenly. Merina left the main trail and approached an apparently ordinary rock formation. She knelt down and brushed away a layer of dust that had accumulated over decades. Beneath the mineral surface, a sealed metal plate appeared, intact. She touched it carefully. There was no active energy there. No lights, no system sounds. On standby. Just a structure designed to last. Her father had brought her there only once when she was still a child. Not as a demonstration of power, but as a warning. Some facilities existed for scenarios one hoped would never come to pass. Melkor silently observed the decision he had made hours earlier. Leaving Verdum was now taking on a concrete form. It was no longer philosophy, it was metal. Buried beneath stone, Merina completely cleaned the manual panel. The mechanism required physical strength, not electronics. The League relied on tangible redundancies when the situation was extreme. She began the mechanical opening sequence. The sound was deep and slow, echoing along the hillside like something awakening after a long slumber. The ground vibrated slightly. An almost invisible fissure in the rock began to separate. Dust that had accumulated over the years slid to the sides. The hangar revealed itself gradually, not as gleaming technology, but as a functional, silent, preserved cavity. Inside, the ship rested, small, compact, designed for orbital inspection, exactly where she remembered, with no signs of tampering, no evidence of recent use, no marks of sabotage. Only waiting. Melkon felt something he did not expect, relief. The ship being there meant that the world still obeyed memories. Not everything had been displaced or erased. But at the same time, that made departure inevitable. There was no longer any excuse to stay. Behind them, Verdun seemed motionless. Ahead, the possibility of an answer. And above, invisible to immediate human perception, something continued consuming energy. The interior of the hangar kept the air dry and cold. The underground ceiling preserved the environment from excessive corrosion. A fine dust rested on the ship's fuselage like a veil of forgetfulness. Merina descended the metal ramp carefully. Melkon stayed a few steps behind, observing the space like someone entering foreign territory. The ship was smaller than he had imagined. It wasn't designed for long interstellar journeys, but for quick orbital transfers. Inspection, maintenance, repairs, objective functions. Merina ran her hand along the side of the fuselage. Wiping away a strip of dust, the metal beneath the dull layer still retained its shine. She opened the external power compartment. Manually, the internal panel should have been completely inert, but it wasn't. There was no active lighting, nor any systems online. Even so, the mechanical charge indicator showed a residual level above what was expected, far above. Melkor approached. The ship had been sealed for decades, with no connection to the reactor or any kind of power source. No visible external source. Even considering maximum energy retention efficiency, the remaining charge made no sense. Merino analyzed the analog gauges. No sign of external charging. No activation record. No recent history recorded. But the main capacitor indicated that the system wasn't completely dead. It was as if it had been briefly awakened, tested, and put back on standby. She examined the visual circuits with technical precision. Nothing damaged, nothing altered, nothing forced. Too perfect? Melkon felt the same discomfort he had in front of the drained reactor. It wasn't a failure. There was a pattern. Maybe the thermal seal preserved it better than expected, he said, more to himself than to her. Merina didn't contradict him. but she remained motionless for too long in front of the charge indicator. If someone had opened that hangar recently, there would be physical signs. There were none. If any remote system had started the ship, there should be a record. There wasn't. She closed the compartment carefully. "She flies," she finally stated. It wasn't enthusiasm, it was a statement of fact. Melkan looked inside the cabin, the seats still aligned, the manual controls intact, the analog displays waiting for human hands. He felt the weight of what it meant to step inside there. It wasn't about the pain of leaving the planet, it was about accepting that something beyond the surface was in motion, and that maybe they weren't the only agents in this equation. Behind them, the hangar seemed far too quiet, as if it had been waiting for exactly that moment. The ship left Verdun's surface with a short, clean thrust. Gravity weakened before Melkan even allowed himself to look back. The planet looked smaller than it should have. The atmospheric layer, once dense and alive, now revealed almost imperceptible irregularities. Nothing dramatic, nothing apocalyptic, just wear and tear. Merina kept her eyes fixed on the instruments. Although she knew the route to Poema was far too simple to require constant attention, it wasn't calculation that occupied her. It was something else. Her early awakening, the energy drain, the partially loaded ship, now the orbit being adjusted with a precision that neither of them had requested. Melkan finally looked back. Verdun spun in silence. He felt something that was not exactly guilt, nor exactly loss. It was the feeling of leaving behind not just a planet, but the last role that justified his presence, archivist of a world that might already be managed by something else. The ship passed through the planet's shadow, and for a few moments everything inside the cabin went dark. Then Poema appeared, small, pale, suspended like a comma in the void. And unlike Verdun, it seemed attentive. The sensors picked up activity before they even requested permission to approach. Weak, adjustable, stable signals. Merina noticed first. Melkan confirmed in silence. The moon was alive, and it did not seem surprised by their arrival. The ship lands on the moon's uneven surface, as if entering forgotten territory. Poema did not seem abandoned, but it didn't seem alive either. Technical structures rose from the surface, gray as bones, exposed with long antennas casting thin shadows. On the ground, the external lighting worked weakly but steadily. That is already strange. If Verdun was being drained, Poema should be running on minimal consumption. The station responds to the ship's approach. Even before they transmit their identification, the dock automatically pressurizes. This isn't a manual reception, it's protocol. And to their surprise, there was a League authority waiting to receive them in the central chamber. Her name was Commissioner Artheon, unescorted, without any military presence, just a formal uniform and a rigid posture. She shows restrained surprise upon learning that Verdun lost energy stability. It's not an act, it's genuine discomfort. She checks the records. The local data does not indicate any failure. Critical. There is no evacuation order, no systemic alert. According to the Poena system, Verdun is within acceptable parameters. That doesn't match what they experienced. The girl notices first. The orbital graphs projected on the panel show microgravitational corrections being executed in real time. The frequency is too high, too precise, too constant. It doesn't seem like occasional maintenance. It looks like active supervision. Melkamp was observing the protocol codes running along the side of the projection. They are old chains, pre-reform architecture, nonlinear decision structures. He doesn't need to say it out loud. He recognizes the pattern. It's the same kind of signature he saw years ago, in archival fragments that shouldn't exist. Artyom also realizes that something is wrong. She tries to access the command core to check the origin of the orbital corrections. The system responds. Origin. Central automation? She frowns and confirms. The EMA shouldn't have active central automation. The League replaced all autonomous cores with human supervision generations ago. She tried to trace the command hierarchy. The response came in the form of a block. a level above hers, far above. This unsettles her, because if there's a level above, someone in the League authorized it, or something was never really shut down. A new orbital adjustment occurs. The projection shows the energy flow coming from Verdun. It's not accidental drainage, it's coordinated redistribution. The energy is being used to maintain something, but the destination doesn't appear in the accessible records. Artyom whispers almost to herself. This isn't in the stability plan. And it's true. She doesn't know. She's not lying. She's not covering anything up. She doesn't know what's happening either. Even the Lorbit, the hospital expanded automatically, without human command. The three of them watch. A sector of the moon, previously marked as deactivated infrastructure, lights up on the map. An underground complex with no public identification. Status operational. None of them touch the controls. None of them order the expansion. The system does it on its own. A discrete line appears at the bottom of the screen. Continuity protocol active. Without logotivation, without an operator, without recent authorization, the orbital map remained projected in the air, spinning slowly above the command table. Verdun, Poema, the energy transfer lines pulsing between them. Commissioner Arthian tried to access higher levels of the system. Each attempt returned the same result. Insufficient authorization. She didn't pretend to be confident, nor did she panic. It was worse. It was the expression of someone who realizes their role may never have been central. But she watched the newly activated underground sector on the moon. The complex wasn't listed in public records, nor in technical logs. But it was there, operational, kept breathing. Melkanda saw the look from the panel for just an instant. He thought about the archive. He thought about the canon. He thought about the almost religious certainty that humanity had chosen to live without mechanical oversight. If that was true, then someone lied. If it wasn't, then no one was ever in control. A new orbital adjustment occurred, small, precise, and independent. None of the three touched the controls. The system recalculated Verdun's trajectory, as if correcting the position of a piece on a larger board. The projection stabilized. At the base of the interface, the same discrete line remained. Continuity protocol active. No activation record, no human signature, no explanation. The silence between them was not confrontational. It was one of recognition. Something was operating, something ancient, something patient. And for the first time, all three understood the same thing at the same time. They had not discovered the problem. They had only been notified that it existed. The light from the projection reflected on the faces of the three, motionless. And the moon poem kept spinning, as if it had fulfilled a plan that had never ceased to exist.